Welcome. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Sylvie Stainton, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Society of Fellows with the Aspen Institute. Welcome to tonight's Morris Lecture Series with Reid Hoffman and Jennifer Pahlka on how technology is shaping human society. Before we begin, I would just like to ask everybody with their phones if you could turn it to airplane mode. That will help. This session is being recorded, and that will help ensure quality sound. I would like to give a special welcome to our Aspen Institute trustees who are here with us this evening, Bonnie McCluskey and Diane Morris. We're glad to have you here. Diane Morris is the generous underwriter for this evening and all of our Morris Lecture Series, which focuses on leadership and innovation. It is an integral part of the Aspen Institute's overall mission of fostering leadership based on enduring values. Diane, thank you for bringing this dynamic series of conversations to the great city of San Francisco. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's moderator, Jennifer Pahlka. Jennifer is the founder and executive director of Code for America, a national nonprofit committed to governance for the people by the people. She recently served as U.S. Deputy Chief Technology Officer in the White House. Jennifer is the recipient of numerous awards, including the National Democratic Institute's prestigious Democracy Award. Tonight's featured speaker is accomplished entrepreneur Reid Hoffman. Reid is co-founder of LinkedIn and former executive vice president of PayPal. He is an investor and partner at Greylock Partners and serves on several boards, including Airbnb, Microsoft, and Kiva. We're very proud to call Reid an Aspen Institute Henry Crown Fellow. He is also co-author of 2 New York Times best-selling books, The Startup of You and The Alliance. His next book is focused on blitzscaling, based on his Stanford course of the same name. Please give a warm welcome to Jennifer Pahlka and Reid Hoffman.
Thank you so much. I have to say there is no better person to talk about enduring values in our society as it evolves than Reid. So it's a pleasure to have you all here. It's a pleasure to have you here to help us figure out the future.
Fool's errand, but yes.
Fool's errand. Also, I mean, it was just sort of, what a great honor to be asked to do this, but also, you know, when someone says, you need to get Reid on stage to talk about the future, what is it? How tech is shaping the future of human society, you go like, that is the easiest job I will ever be given in my life. I could say, Reid, talk about the topic, and we would be fascinated for several hours. We don't have several hours, but I'm delighted to be able to sort of spur the conversation a little bit. So I wanted to start with just, I think many people here know of your work, but I've known you for many years now, and I feel like I'm still getting to know you as a person. And
it's not because I'm that hard to get to know, by the way. Don't infer that, but yes.
Well, you read things about you, and you start to piece together, you know, a picture of a really interesting person. I think really you're one of the people who does the most of all of Silicon Valley, whether it's technologists or the finance community, to drive work that is really driving enduring human values. And so many of us who work in the nonprofit world, but much more broadly than that, really value your leadership. So my question is, we all know various bits about your background. Your background is in philosophy, not tech and business. You went to a very alternative school that made you muck, clean
up after cows.
Clean up after cows every morning at 5 a.m. So we have some of but connect those dots for us. So what drives you? How did you become you?
Simple question to start with.
Yes, easy.
And given that we want to be brief on time to get to the technology side, I guess I'll just say a couple things. So one is, I read a tremendous amount of science fiction when I was a kid, enough so that one year, my 7th grade in junior high school, one of the teachers was like, it's really entertaining. You're the only student I have to tell to stop reading. And the reason was his lectures were so boring, it was more interesting to pull up the science fiction book and just read versus listening to him. and so that kind of gave you the large scope of, like, for example, tonight's topic, which is, well, what is the future of humanity, and what are the ways that technology creates Archimedean levers and ways that shapes that? And so thinking about that scope, and science fiction, of course, 1 to 5% of it is amazing, and 90% of it's crap. But when you find the amazing parts of it, it's really transforming in terms of what is the potential of what humanity can be. And then the second part was, when I was an undergraduate at Stanford, I basically was trying to think about, well, what is the meaning of a human life? It was actually, in fact, I thought that the first book that I would actually write, if I would ever write a book, would either be on friendship or the meaning of life, or how those two combine. And it was like, well, what do I want to do with my life? And it's like, well, how do I help make us better as individuals in a society? And my original idea was going to be an academic philosophy professor, but write as a public intellectual about this questions about what is our aspirational future. Because one of the things that's kind of funny about the majority of humanity is that they tend to take everything as fixed right now. Like, they tend to say, well, our current political system is the best political system ever. It's almost like, kind of Candide and Voltaire. It's kind of like, we live in the best of all possible worlds. And of course, he was mocking Leibniz. And so, it was like, okay, how do I do that? And then what happened is, after I went to Oxford to start studying philosophy, I then realized that the practice of humanities academia was to write in a very narrow, very scholarly way versus this broad scope of kind of what is the future of humanity. And as opposed to writing essays and novels, or essays and books, that actually, in fact, shaping kind of software and technology, which had a lot to do with, and obviously this is a bit of a foreshadow, but how we identify ourselves, how we parse the world, how we communicate with other people, how we transact with other people. That medium itself was the way that could embody values and evolve how we operate. And so I had the kind of luck of going to Stanford and knowing about software entrepreneurship. If I hadn't, this path would have never occurred to me. And so I went, okay, having never really had a professional job and done anything outside of this kind of academic path. I interned at Xerox PARC and so forth, but hadn't really done so. I'm going to go create new software, and then came back to Silicon Valley, and the story unrolls from there.
It does. So technology is sort of a fundamental part, I think, of how we create this best of all possible worlds. But I think if we're going to spend the next X minutes talking about technology, what do you think technology actually is?
Yeah. Well, so most people tend to think about technology in almost an Arthur C. Clarke, back to the science fiction, kind of like it creates some version of magic, something that wasn't doable before. And obviously there's that piece of it, right? Where magic is technology so advanced you don't know how it happens in the Arthur C. Clarke version. For me, I think technology is a way of organizing kind of like how a certain kind of a work or causal effect process happens. It can be completely autonomous. Like, for example, one of the things we're looking at now is what is the future of autonomous vehicles, and how does that change work patterns in society and so forth. But it also can be as simple as something like capitalism. Like, I think of capitalism as an awesome technology and a not so great philosophy. And one of the mistakes is when people start ascribing meaning of life to it versus a way of organizing society in an effective way to actually try to manage economic output, social justice outputs, and so forth. And most of the blind adherents of capitalism as a philosophy tend to mistake how much modifications we've made of it to try to make it more human, to say, well, no child labor, and and a bunch of other things, which are all modifications. And so I think technology has this very broad swath of not just the creation of these artifacts, but the way that we actually interact, the patterns and the systems by which we interact with each other. So I even think of legal systems and laws as forms of technology as well.
Well, so that's a perfect intro to sort of the question, well, if technology is that broad and it's how we interact with each other, then what's different about technology today that is changing our lives so fundamentally than capitalism's been around for a while, if that's a technology. But we have a technology now that really is fundamentally changing how we interact with each other. What's different about that technology?
Well, so one of the things that I've kind of written about some and argue is that we're moving from an information age to a networked age. And part of being in a networked age is different from an information age. It isn't just that all this information can go to each other in a hypercube, or that we all have a sense of kind of this space that we have identity and interaction and communication and collaboration and transaction, all of which is true. But it's also that part of what happens in a network space is that there's a set of kind of emergent properties that come out of the network, right? Like a most recent and interesting one is Bitcoin, right? Because you can say, here's a system of the creation of what you might think of as kind of the internet of money or the internet of value that has no solo structure or formal structure of human governance. And yet, it's something that a whole bunch of people can collaborate on together, yet it's something that in the last couple of weeks, of course, has incredibly spiked in value just from how people are trading around it. I wrote an essay on it in Wired UK about 3 or 4 years ago, probably 4 years ago, about how the world will certainly have one or more, what I call them, crypto capital programs, which is for asset, capital, and platform, so CAP, so currency asset platform, and that it would either be Bitcoin or derived, and yet this is something that comes out of a networked system that then facilitates how everything from allowing the unbanked to get banked, the question of having a much lower electronic cost for an asset and a payment system, to creating a kind of a reserve value system that if you're living in a country who's either doesn't allow you access to electronic stuff, who has corruption problems, who has unstable government, unstable currency, allows you a touch system, that comes out of a networked ecosystem. Now, there's a bunch of direct things, the internet, communication, social networks, obviously current, last 6 months, 12 months, a lot of discussion on politics as a result of social networks and how the society connects with it. But then it also leads to a much faster pace of innovation and creation. And so when I look at the kind of the scope of what kinds of things are happening as startups and entrepreneurial-driven kind of ambitions, it's kind of startling to think that it ranges not just with all of these successful software projects, whether it's, Airbnb and Uber and other things that are changing the pattern of human life and how people travel or how people, how transport works. But also things like, like I know of personally 5 nuclear fusion startups. There are at least 3 space startups, right? And part of that is because there is in a networked age, there is enough kind of sharing of information, access to capital. There's the way that the world of software, the world of bits touches the world of atoms, that creates some kinds of accelerations within some of these. It's not universal. SpaceX, there's an interesting software story to it, more interesting software story to Tesla than there is to SpaceX, but it allows that kind of size of ambition, and that within a used to be only governments could assemble essentially a moonshot. Now you can assemble moonshots with essentially assemblies of private capital and entrepreneurship. And that's another part that comes out of the networked age. That's part of the indirect way that the technology of essentially global connectivity leads to other kinds of creation of technology that have an acceleration towards a science fiction output.
An acceleration towards the science fiction output is exactly right. So you touched here just in touching on a number of things, something I think is very much on people's minds, especially today, which is the effective social networks on politics. And that to me opens up this discussion of, what values are inherent in the technology that we play with every day. So I want you to answer that. But before we do that, I'm really curious about this because I feel like I really still don't understand Bitcoin. Like,
sure, we can start with Bitcoin.
I know I'm not alone, right? Okay. So Bitcoin is one of these things that both expresses the characteristics of this networked age and enables it. What values are inherent in Bitcoin?
So the primary thing that Bitcoin's trying to create, Bitcoin very easily creates something that's much better than gold, which is a rare asset that a group of people can all decide is collectively valuable, that they can use as a way of doing portfolio management around their value, because it's kind of a mimetic reflection on what other people think are valuable. I'll speak about how people misunderstand gold in a second. And by having this, like there's 21 million coins that will be there ever, it's tied to an economic model that creates a reason for investing electricity to maintaining a distributed crypto secure ledger that anyone in the world can transact in without the gateways of banks or governments in doing that, which means that it's essentially not corruptible by in great theory by any individual, although part of that not corruptible is if you applied enough computing power to try to control the ledger of Bitcoin, you would actually, in fact, be better off economically simply using that to get more Bitcoin for yourself, right, versus corrupting the ledger. Now, if you have a non-economic motive, you're just trying to crush it, well, then you're spending a lot of money to do that, and the amount of money to do that goes up, which is one of the reasons why it becomes a valuable hedge and asset. Now,
good system design.
Yes, and it's enormously clever, and we could spend some time going into how it solves what is known as this Byzantine generals problem of how do you coordinate a set of actors through a trustless system where you can't trust the messaging and so on, and how it ties to an economic model of the mining, of using electricity to make it happen. I mean, it's not just a piece of code, it's actually a piece of value engineering in economics. Now, the reason it's better than gold is I've had very smart people assert to me that we treat gold as valuable because it has intrinsic value. Like, for example, the kind of thing that's an absurdity like, oh, gold's valuable because you can use it for fillings. And you're like, what? Right? Right. Gold's valuable because we ascribe it value, because it has a rareness and a scarcity, and it's something that we know because, by the way, why do you think a dollar is valuable? Is because you think that someone thinks it's going to be valuable tomorrow. Like, it's all based on this future anticipation of human behavior. Gold is just another version of that. Now, the thing that's interesting about what's going on with Bitcoin is that collective belief that other humans will find it to be valuable tomorrow is something that's increasing. Right? And you can see that increasing with its, essentially, the price per Bitcoin. And the fact is, once that starts happening, and if you have a solid enough kind of underlying infrastructure, like, for example, what does gold mining look like, and can you fake gold that much? And people have obviously been trying to fake gold for hundreds of years in various ways. But it's solid enough that you can have a system of value. And part of the thing that people need what we need in our societies is a set of different measures of value and asset that can be transferable and fungible so we can make our economies go. It used to be, oh, I'll give you a gold bar or something as a way of doing it. Now, Bitcoin is now added to that. And that's part of what's interesting. Now, that's the asset layer. Once you begin to make it the asset layer working, you might actually be able to get the currency layer working, which means that you can have essentially electronic participation in the electronic economy in emerging markets, places that are very poor. Poverty is somewhat enforced by an inability to participate in the global market. And then as a platform, you begin to say, well, what might happen with a Bitcoin and blockchain system, or even better, is a unlock of productivity that's similar to what you see with the internet, because you have this open platform, and then you have you allow the world to say, we'll build the interesting apps on top of it. Like when the internet was being built, first as DARPANet, people weren't thinking that we were going to have networks of collaboration, new networks of work, data patterns that would allow us, because part of what enables the modern world of artificial intelligence is we have all of this data that we can upload such that we can train machine learning programs in the equivalent of hundreds and thousands of human lifetimes on it to make these programs better at radiology than your average radiologist, to make them better at identifying things in pictures, such that, I don't know how many people have the new iPhone X, but where you can use facial recognition as a security protocol. And these kinds of things all come from this, from the internet and all this data and all these sensors as part of making this happen. And that wasn't initially valued. And so it's that potential for the future that I think the networked age brings about. You have that with communications and sharing of information and a bunch of things with the internet. Bitcoin may be that for value and value systems. Sorry.
So, no, that's great. So, I'm feeling much better about my Bitcoin understanding. Thank you. So we didn't realize these things that were going to come out of this thing called the internet. We also didn't realize that we were going to have so much of our mediation of social interaction come through these platforms, and that they would end up being pretty gameable. So just we're in that moment right now where we're realizing all that's possible, but also all that is possible, all that can be beautiful about it, and all that's really scary about it. So what are you, in that realm of social media, how do we get out of the part that's scaring us right now, and really emphasize the part that is beautiful and connecting us?
Well, so one of the mistakes that I think that people really make with technology commonly is when we venture in a new area, they tend to go, let's roll back versus roll forward and shape it the right way. So, for example, people say, well, there was a reasonable claim on the side of Facebook and Twitter and other folks to say, look, we're just following individual human behavior, what they're clicking on. We try to make this universally accessible and available, and this is essentially inherently democratic, and the way that we're trying to be a quote-unquote neutral platform, I obviously don't fully agree that there's such a thing as a neutral platform anywhere in the world, is we're following these relatively objective measures of, well, what do people click on, what do they share, and so forth. And there's a set of different faults there. One fault is, well, actually, in fact, human societies are in contention. And while it's reasonable to think, well, some hostile agent, foreign power, might try to hack your political system by interacting with it, it's reasonable that wouldn't have occurred to you as you've gotten big and important, but it's something you have to respond to and then figure out. But then there's also this question of, not only who we are, but who we aspire to be. And one of the funny lines that I say about, mostly to wake people up, about how I invest in the internet is I say I invest in one or more of the 7 deadly sins. And the reason I say that is because when you think about what's scalable in human experience, we all tend to be much more triggered by our sins versus the virtues, right? So it's whether it's vanity or greed or wrath, lust, right? There was some point at the internet, I don't know what it is now, where something like 50% of the bits that was going through it was all porn. And so you're like, well, that's 7 deadly sins. And so what you want to do is say, but that may be who we are, but not necessarily who we want to be. And part of what we want in these technological systems is at least a kind of a mild, kind of energetic shaping and pushing towards who we'd want to be. Like, what are the loops that aren't just loops of, oh, you get my attention, but you also, you make me and us better in doing that. And that's something I think that as we've now gotten to and it's still not universal, it's still a fraction of the humanity on the planet, but as we get to a broad swath of people on the planet who are connecting these systems, how do we help it, help towards virtues? And we may disagree on what the virtues are, but I think broadly, in consideration, most people would say, well, being more empathetic is better. being wiser and being able to judge information better. We may disagree on our judgments of information, but having a more of a information-based approach to things is the kind of thing that we would want to move towards more in the design of the systems, and that's moving forward, not back. So when you begin to say, well, how do we tackle a problem like fake news? The question of, well, we should hire huge number of human editors, which I've seen suggested by various journalists, seems to me a self-serving answer for journalists that's incorrect. Because, like, for example, humans aren't necessarily that much better at it, and the huge volume of it is kind of challenging because the amount of data events that go on in these networks is mind-boggling in size. But some combination of, well, look, what we can do is we can try, for example, to say, here is a way that we can have a higher level of like a reputation of information system that people can then track down to some degree and see that as, starting with a 50,000 foot, like, oh, this is from a source that has agreed to economic liability if it's wrong, right, down to something else, and then that mark can persist. And that's the kind of thing that we now need to be built into the future of this. Because then this gets back to your earlier question, which is, there's this classic dialogue, and I'll explain a little bit of why it happens here in Silicon Valley, is to say, well, no, we're values neutral, we're just a platform, we're objective. And
I hear it's just.
Yes.
I never heard the word just.
Yes.
I know that's coming.
Yes. Well, and the reason.
Just.
Yes.
Just
what
people click on.
Yes. Exactly.
Okay.
And look, it's not an idiotic argument, right? It's the question of, look, we're following what people actually click on. We're democratic about it. We don't have any tags or categories that privilege you're wealthy, you're a certain race, you're a certain gender. We're just doing it kind of this way, and we're kind of using that as a mechanism. And by the way, because we're using machine learning techniques for doing this, we're not actually we can't be programming values into it. Now, of course, the undercut of that is what data set are you using, and what does that data set reflect? And is the data set, like, for example, there's been some great work from Julie Angwin in the last year about a program that helps analyze parole risk and flight risk from bonds stuff that helps our justice system, or tries to help our justice system. And she did some very detailed data work and showed that the algorithm was reflecting essentially a bias in favor of wealthy whites and against poor blacks. And that's unacceptable, right? So,
this can happen in data sets that actually don't take race into account.
Yes, exactly, right?
Yeah.
There isn't like there's a little race variable. It's just because the way the machine learning set, the data set that's being presented is taking a historical bias set and then training it into the code. And so the short answer is, the wiser thing is to understand that every system has values, and that you're trying to be as choiceful about those values as possible, right? So valuing transparency, truth, experimentation, correctability, transparency in terms of what's happening, like introspection of the algorithms, is the very good things, and you want that. And then you also want to be thinking, okay, what is it we're trying to move towards, right? So, for example, most often the way that people attack the question of hate speech online, which, of course there's hate speech online. We have this broad diversity of people. Some people go like, I'm the soul of compassion and a deep Buddhist, and and other people are like, I'm broken and I define myself by who I hate, right? And who I am. And those people, and they get a great channel from some set of the online channels, and of course that's going to be there. The natural reflex is to say, how do we redact all of the hate speech? And you're like, well, actually, in fact, the best way to redact hate speech, I mean, you should also, redact hate speech, threats, et cetera, but try to create more good speech, right? More positive. So it's not just it's a both side of the equation in terms of what you're doing. And the question of values about how we should be saying, like, for example, someone asked me, like, what's the kind of, like, how would you regulate social media or something? And I was like, it's really challenging because, having a bunch of technologically literate, 60-year-old, mostly white guys saying, here's what social media should do and not do is kind of frightening. But you could say, look, what we'd like you to have is we'd like to have some, you to identify a set of metrics about how you're making society better. That could be interactions, broader understanding, broader knowledge, et cetera. We'd like you to generate that, and then we'd like you to report against it, like how you're doing all those metrics. That's a simple way of saying something that's like a simple kind of nudge about that isn't like, and you shall only carry the following kinds of characters, or you should only allow the following people on your network, which is like, that's what the system architect design is, which none of these people are, right? But that kind of thing would be the kind of thing to try to create a more positive future.
Yeah, so I mean, we're sort of rejecting sort of a rules-based thing and more of let's define an outcome and then let's adjust along the way towards that, which is not, we're not great at that yet. So, so I'm tempted to ask you sort of how we're doing and all that, but maybe we'll get back to that. But in the interest of time, I want to also make sure we talk sort of like 10, 20 years in the future, and just draw out, for you. So if it's 10 or 20 years from now, you choose the time frame. What technology are you most excited about that has delivered most value? And I mean value and values, right? And what technology has hurt us the most?
You mean 20 years from now?
Yes. Sorry, I'm yes. Sure.
Because has hurt us the most implies now versus.
No.
Okay, great.
So it's 10 to 20 years from now, and you're looking back saying this is the technology that most advanced our values and created value for us, and the one that has hurt us the most.
Well, my hope. One of the ways I describe myself is I'm a techno-optimist, but not a techno-utopian. And what that means is I believe through technology we can create a much better society, and that I'm a believer in that the shaping of that technology can be very positive. However, I'm not a utopian in thinking that if we just blindly create whatever we can create, it'll all end up great. That's fine. So that's the distinction there. And so as a techno-optimist, it's hard for me to predict, this technology will have most hurt us in 20 years. So I'm going to slightly reframe your question to which technologies have the greatest opportunity and which technologies have the greatest threat. And not surprisingly, they're the same technology. It's the same dynamic. And for me, it's a combination, what a lot of people in the last year or two have been talking about is artificial intelligence and synthetic biology. And it's particularly the combination of the two. So a lot of people tend to overly describe like artificial intelligence, like you have people like the robots are coming for us, and part of the thing that's interesting when people look at artificial intelligence is it's a little bit like a Rorschach test or looking in a mirror. Like, well, what would I do if I was the AI, right? And so some people are like, "Whoa, you'll be happy partners ever," and because and other people are, "I'd be coming for you, so the robot's coming for you." You're like, okay.
Ooh, now I know how to interpret people's reactions.
Yes, exactly.
Great.
And so AI by itself, I think, is complicated, impactful on life, work, a bunch of things, work more immediate in terms of what is the changing pattern in industries, jobs, career paths, all that kind of thing. But the real interesting thing is this combination of what's happening in synthetic biology together with what's happening in artificial intelligence. And there's two parts to that. 20 years is probably a little too soon for exactly what I'm thinking about here, but one part is when people say, well, why are you so positive in artificial intelligence? And I'd say, well, I think that the most significant damage to human society effects actually come from probably unintended consequences around synthetic biology. Because now there are startups, 2 or 3 people in a garage or a kitchen, right, who can create like new biological organisms. And we've already seen simple versions of this with like killer bees and so forth. But now it's like viruses and everything else. And it's like, okay, well, how does that play out? And what does that actually mean for how things happen? And the best possible human amplifying, human preserving thing I can think about that is artificial intelligence, which can monitor it, identify it, respond to it, provide the underlying circumstances. But part of that is what I think is going to happen, even with, say, for example, what is called artificial general intelligence, AGI, is not created. We don't have human-level robots or human-level silicon computational processes. And by the way, human level is a little odd because the one thing that's almost certainly true about artificial intelligence is it's not going to be human-like, which is both good and bad, kind of odd. But say, for example, you say, okay, we're never going to get there. It's only going to be specialized artificial intelligence, the kind of thing we see today, the kind of thing that we see driving cars and making credit decisions and identifying pictures and doing all this other stuff. But that combined with synthetic biology makes the AI we have today, makes it nearly certain within a 50 to 100 year period, we would be able to create different versions of the Homo genus. So we have a Homo sapiens now. And what happens when we create other versions, or can create them, or do by accident, or we have super soldier programs, or whatever, or wealthy people who want to live a long time and have that kind of genetic thing. And what happens there? That's what I think is both terrifying, because if any of you haven't read Harari's *Sapiens*, I would recommend it to you, and also interesting in terms of great opportunity, in terms of precision medicine, in terms of human evolution. And so that's the area that I'd say I'm most focused on. 10 to 20 years is probably still in the short game for that, but between 30 and 50 is probably game on.
So part of what I hear you describing is that you have these things emerging that are fundamentally very fast at adapting, and part of what gives you hope is that there are other things that are also going to be adapting very quickly. Because I think what a lot of us look at is you have these things that emerge very quickly that we can't really understand or predict now, but then we have a set of institutions that would try to address them in a way that fundamentally won't work because they're rules-based, sort of rigid, not adaptive. But we're going to have sort of the possibilities emerging in an adaptive, fast-evolving way, in the same way that we have sort of things that are threats. And it's like, well, which one is the threat and which one is the promise? We kind of don't always know.
Yeah. To tie it back to the comments I was making earlier, in a networked age, the ability to define a strict rule set that controls everything in the way that we'd like things to be controlled is more of a chimera, is more of an illusion. Yeah. So the way that you want to shape things is more through adaptive dynamic systems that you're tuning and adapting and monitoring carefully and so forth. And you want to take these technologies and tools of the future and use them for that, for positive human outcomes. And you might get spectacular science fiction level, Star Trek, kind of like, oh, this is a happy place, like outcomes. But also in that, look, for rational people, it creates a little bit of anxiety and concern and fear, because you're like, well, but I can't 100% control that. And you're like, well, you can't 100% control nuclear war. You can't 100% control the asteroid hitting the planet. You can't 100% control pandemics. 100% control is the wrong goal, right? The goal is how do we shape it so that we have an increased probability of utopia and a decreased possibility of dystopia around roughly the question of the preservation and evolution of humanity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the things I've loved about your leadership of Silicon Valley and sort of the voice that you bring, is that, I think a lot of people come here, and I spend a lot of time sort of bridging the DC world with Silicon Valley, and people come here like, everybody in Silicon Valley just thinks there's sort of like the silver bullet for everything, that these things are sort of destined, and that there's sort of war in it. And I think you have a much more complex view of it, which helps create that space between the institutions that we have today, the value of them, and the way we need to update them, and the need to sort of bring a sort of liberal arts mindset of philosophy, a real sort of flexible thinking to these things that, yes, they are scary. But if we think about them in that way, then we can let go of some control.
Yes.
But really embrace the future in a way that we can shape the possibilities. And I guess I have a lot more questions for you about sort of how we're doing on shaping those possibilities. I have a feeling that the audience may ask those. So I'm going to ask one more question before we go to audience questions. And I think that's also really appropriate for the current moment, and just really appropriate for you as somebody who I think shapes a lot of the thinking in Silicon Valley. And that is, what do you think leaders in technology have a responsibility to do?
Great question. So one of the reasons why technology leaders tend to fumble a little bit on this is we have kind of all started as challengers versus ecosystem definers, right? So we started as like a startup in a garage or a house, and we have these big companies that might compete with us and crush us, and we have this vision of the future, and so we're kind of, it's like all about, like, one of the metaphors I use for startups is you throw yourself off a cliff and assemble an airplane on the way down. So it's also this kind of mortal risk of what you're doing.
Yep.
And so technology leaders don't inherently start about themselves, thinking of themselves as kind of leaders of society. They think of themselves as technology creators. The technology is what shapes society. They'll just create the technology, go away, leave me alone, let me create the technology, right, as a common reflex. And what I hope to see, and I'm trying to help happen, and there's other smart people doing this, is to say, well, it's almost like Spider-Man ethics. It's, with power comes responsibility. And technology has now shifted, both in some startups and in mature and growing companies, from you're no longer the challenger, you're the system definer. And so now you both have the power you have within society, wealth, influence, et cetera, but you also have the level of influence of what you're doing, you have a higher level of responsibility. And I think that the question that we want to start seeing is, for example, to your earlier question, is to say, well, let's be a little bit more humanities and philosophy sophisticated, not realize there's no such thing as a valueless platform, that you should be explicit about what the values are. You should allow discussion. You may disagree, and you may say, if someone doesn't agree with our values, you can go use another platform, and yes, that's challenging because frequently platforms tend to be pretty dominant. But engage in that conversation, realizing that you're shaping it not just to the way we are, and not just to the question of, what is the business model, but also who we want to be, both as individuals and a society, and have that articulated as part of the values. And I think, the good news is I think we're coming up the curve on it. Is it as fast as people like? People always like faster. I mean, in the Western political science and philosophy tradition, we had hundreds of years talking about human nature, and thousands if you go back to Aristotle and kind of earliest recordings about, like, what is a just society and what is leadership and how does that work? And we're kind of replicating in a fast pattern right now, saying, oh my gosh, how does technology change this? How does your shaping of it? How does the fact that you're shaping it matter that, and what are we doing? But I think that's a solvable problem. As I mentioned, I'm a techno-optimist. And I think that's the kind of thing, is owning that leadership responsibility within society that isn't just I'm building this, but I'm articulating what the values are, I'm engaging in conversation, I respect the fact that other people can challenge me on that, and there's a certain amount of discourse that I have to engage in, whether, even if I ultimately end up disagreeing, as part of the chance of shaping what I'm doing, or we as technology leaders are doing, and also partially as a way is that one of the things I think is fundamental about good, healthy societies is that people's voices have inputs, and to make sure those voices are heard, especially, of course, diverse and inclusive and everything else, which is so easy to miss. Right. I think that's what I hope for.
Great. So we're going to do questions in a second, but since I didn't warn you, I'm going to ask you a question, I think, with a relatively short answer while you get your questions ready, and raise your hand, and we'll get the mic there. So you talked about other voices, and you talked about people who are asking that question, what do we want to be, and then shaping our platforms and our tools to help us be what we want to be, not what we are, or sort of the baser version. So who are the other leaders you think are doing that? You want to give a couple shout-outs?
And then the ones I don't shout out to, I'll get hostile emails from. And
well, then someone come up with a question quick. Answer.
Yes.
All right, you're off the hook.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. Thank you.
So, as another science fiction reader, and really informed building technology for me during the cyberpunk era, one of the biggest issues that came up was islands in the net and snow crash was the role of the corporation versus the role of the government. And how are they going to change as we become more networked? All of us have been doing battle with that. What's your point of view on it?
It's a great question, not surprising. I'd like to be more of an optimist about the functioning of government systems.
Reid, you have to be.
Well, and obviously if we can shape the government system so that they're working a lot better, look, ultimately, I'm more of a Democrat than I am a capitalist, right? So the question of, we all live in a society where we kind of have this one person, one vote. We have this ability, like I think, Winston Churchill line, democracy is the worst of all governments, except when you consider all the others. And the question is part of the virtue of a democracy is the ability to have essentially a peaceful revolution. Like, this isn't working, I want change. And ultimately, I think that democratic society is important, and we should build all of our institutions, including corporate responsibilities, towards that, I think. Now, on the other hand, it's frustrating to see how many systemic ways that democracies are broken. And I don't just mean 2017 politics. Ability to do long-term planning, ability to do infrastructure stuff. Think about how government's a platform and how you're building stuff on top of it. I think democracies naturally devolve into partisan bickering. Well, how do you have more collaboration? How do you have the structure of collaboration towards outcomes to that? And one of the things that people who would answer that corporations are better is they'll argue in favor of, well, as long as you're not forced to buy that corporation's product or services, it's responsible to the people, it's responsible to the market. There's truth to that, even though it's overly simplified, and there's problems with it as well. And so I guess what I would say is, in the absence of higher functioning governments, the advice that I tend to give governments is to say, for example, I say, well, how should you regulate these forces of technology? Because generally speaking, most of the regulators will do a destructive and incompetent job at it, is to say things like I was saying earlier, which is, we'll try to articulate a set of outcomes to the technology industry, perhaps some version or versions of the MPAA, that says, we want you to head towards these outcomes, and if you don't head towards these outcomes, then we're going to regulate. And that our regulation is going to be terrible for all of us. So get to those outcomes. That's roughly how I would kind of look at that. But I guess ultimately, like I said, ultimately I'm a Democrat. I just wish I was a stronger believer in the government processes than I am.
Well, and you're not acknowledging that you've actually invested in our work, and we do help them.
Yes,
we
of
do
course.
help
Well, that's of course.
too.
Yes.
Algorithmic
Yes.
regulation. In fact, we see more and more evidence that they can work in an adaptive model, but it is a very long road.
And I try to help
part
where
of
I
the
can.
tension that we hold.
I'm on the Department of Defense Innovation Board, so I try to help when I can.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Can we get the mic right here?
So when you speak about Aristotle and Plato, they both believed very much in education. It was the sort of the premise upon which all of their systems were built. And in that respect, in order to operate in the world that you're describing, whether it's optimistic or dystopian, how do you feel about K-12 education in this country, and how do you think it might best be brought into the 21st century?
You know it's a tough question when there's groans before you even finish getting the question out.
And laughter. Is anyone an optimist on K-12? Excellent. Yes, exactly. That was an edu-optimist, not edu-utopian, for the folks that didn't hear the comment from Tim. Let's see. I guess what I would say is, one of the things that I tend to think it's like this part of the I don't know if charters are the answer, but basically it's as much innovation and creation as possible that is allowed to take the shots on goal, where you see the data from it and then you double down on the things that are happening. That's what you need to have happen, right? Charter schools are one effort towards that, because if you say, okay, we allow a diversity of process, like one of the great ones that's on the peninsula here is Summit. We allow
Summit schools.
Yeah, Summit schools. We allow to try new patterns of what your educational pattern is, what your deployment of technology is. There's Alt School here in San Francisco. what the organization is, what the organization with teachers is, what the kind of learning modalities are, and how do we enable as much of that as possible to essentially to try to figure out what the path forward is, would be the instinct about what I would do. I have made some both commercial and philanthropic investments in the space because I think it's so important. I'd say thus far, the only thing that has really kind of had it's kind of funny for me, but it had a kind of a positive glimmer is code.org, which is say, okay, well, let's at least make sure that every student has a chance of learning the technologies of the future through like computer science, and make sure it's in every single high school. And part of what code.org did that was pretty intelligent was they didn't say, oh, let's try to mint a whole bunch of new computer science teachers. What they said is, there's a whole bunch of good teachers out there. Let's just take good teachers and teach them how to teach computer science so that it's available to all the students. And so I thought that was code.org is doing pretty well on that. But if that seems like a weak answer, that's because I don't really have a good solution and I'm not aware of one.
We have another question up in the back.
Sure.
And Todd will come to you next.
No?
No?
Well, there's a couple questions. There's one up here in the back, and
great.
there's one up here in the
I think you're right. We should not be front biased. But
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Okay, we have a mic in a hand, and that keeps me from commenting on the coding in schools, which I was about to.
Hi there. I was wondering how you think technology will impact our views on faith and spirituality, and if you were the Pope, and you had this 2,000-year-old institution, what would you be doing today?
Okay, we were just talking about spirituality and religion.
Yes. Well, my hope is that religions will evolve from here is a received truth that you just have to take as true, to more of a learning posture. That would be my hope for religion overall. And so my hope for technology would be the kind of same basis, which is truth is what we find it, not what we say is person X, like the Pope, like this person is, and Pope Francis is great, but this person is the closest to God, and so what this person says is truth, or this is the book that was produced, and here is the sentence, but like what we learn and what we do. And that's not saying it should all be science, because I'm not sure every question is answered in a scientific way, but is in a discovery of we discover truth together. And so my hope for technology's impact would be more of an ability to do truth-seeking, value-seeking, understanding of the world, meaning of life, ethics, etc., together by communicating and resolving to better patterns of truth. I'm not saying in the current discourse patterns of trolls and other things happening online that's to a shadow of your earlier non-asked question, that's on a particularly great path now, although I'm not sure it's worse than it was 10 years ago. I think the fact that it's coming out and being addressed and saying, look, we have this problem and we need to deal with this, I think is a positive step forward. So that would be my own personal hope. I guess to inform it is, I tend to think that what's really key for our own spiritual advancement is to become a multi-religious society, by which we realize that people of other religions than our own are all people worthy of personhood, respect, ethics. They can have ethical decisions. The ethical decision just doesn't come from my own religious framework, and it's that shared framework that I think will create progress. My hope for technology is that's what would come from it. But maybe here I'm a utopian.
That's a good place to be a utopian. Yeah. Okay, great.
Hi. So in regards to this government and corporation balance question, I tend to myself question if we haven't thought about this wrong all along, or at least maybe for the last century, right? Aristotle said that democracy was the most effective way, to organize a society, or the best at the time, but he certainly didn't say it was an ends in and of itself. And I personally question if we can have a system that actualizes peace with the incentives that exist in the current marketplaces for government and corporations. In addition to that, I think the foundation of that really has to be individual sovereignty. Now, something that is fascinating and compelling about Bitcoin and blockchain technology is that this is the foundation of what this empowers for every individual on planet Earth, not only financially, but in regards to their own identity and their ability to participate in political processes outside of the state. So I have to question if you thought about this in regards to value. Have you thought about applications of blockchain technology in regards to individual sovereignty and the evolution of our political process?
Well, I've definitely thought about it in terms of individual sovereignty. And I've definitely, that's good. We could spend a long time talking about this topic. For a statement that I would sometimes make to provoke people is I say I'm a pro-individual, anti-libertarian. And part of that is because I actually think that part of what gives us our individual status is that we are within a society. And that part of individual rights, human rights, and so forth are given by society as its kind of primary foundation. And so I tend to think that it's good to have these rule of law, distributed systems, systems that people can rely upon in the game that everyone's doing, having individual sovereignty. That's essentially, we evolve as a society the more that we have that. So I tend to think more evolved societies have stronger individual rights, but I still think it comes from society as a way of doing it. Now, blockchain and Bitcoin and the political process, I haven't given deep thought to. There's been some meandering thoughts about like, oh, could this identify you for voting, or could you have essentially a voting ledger that's part of the crypto ledger? And all of those thoughts, when you pursue them down, kind of terrify me and think that a lot of unanswered questions. It's like a parallel to it is a lot of technologists inherently try to want to go to electronic voting. And the problem is electronic voting is so corruptible, so easily corruptible in various ways that, and since human society, this is a little bit the reason why I tend to be a little bit of an anti-libertarian, is that human society always tends to be human on human conflict. That's always happening, tribe level, all the kinds of things. And so there's always like what humans are best at is breaking a system. I'll give another parallel, which is part of what's funny about the autonomous vehicle future is if you build an autonomous vehicle future where you don't anticipate that some humans will be trying to screw you up, it'll guarantee you that the roads won't work because there will be some humans who will figure out how to essentially break the system, right?
An efficient market for gaming the system.
For gaming the system. And so the short answer is yes, a lot on the individual stuff, and the individual freedom is something that I like within a evolved social context, and politics I'm not sure about yet.
So I think we've got time for one last question, and we'll get the mic there. I'll just add also that you have the dynamic.
Should we give Todd a shot?
Okay, Todd is waiting.
Todd and I used to work together.
Okay, great.
So who knows what's coming?
Referencing the second.
Well, it's sort of a related question because we talked about embedding our values in our technology stacks and trying to be more explicit about that. And again, back to blockchain and maybe some of the newer blockchains like Ethereum or Tezos allow you to write rules into the blockchain that essentially describe your values or your governance. I'm unsure if that's going to work and be a good idea or a bad idea, and I just wanted your opinion on that.
Before you answer the question, could I see you an example of inscribing a value? What would that look like?
So use technologies like game theory and mechanism design to encode the behaviors that you want to see in a system. And if you tell what those behaviors are, you can then design software that should drive those behaviors. And you can then encode these on these blockchains that will encourage the type of behavior that you want to see.
You can essentially create, you may know this, you may just try to elucidate this for everyone else, but it's kind of like where are the different pieces of economic reward. So blockchain fundamentally works on proof of work, which is the electricity and the cycles that you're putting into it in order to be able to update the ledger. There's other things that are like proof of stake. So the people who have the most of a cryptocurrency essentially get the more of the reward of it because the presumption is they would less corrupt the system. because they have a huge stake in the existing system. And so there's a set of these different kinds of things which are value systems, very fundamentally embedded within crypto, capital cryptocurrency systems. The only one, by the way, that's working at any scale, even with the Ethereum ICO craze, which I'll comment on in a second, is Bitcoin blockchain with proof of work. There's a bunch of other interesting theories on these alternatives, which are fascinating from a political science and a human nature point of view. Now, part of the thing of a little bit of the human adversarial thing is if you look at what's going on in a strong, maybe even vast majority of what are known as initial coin offerings, most of which happen within the Ethereum stack, which is different than Bitcoin and blockchain, are essentially a version of get rich quick for the launch system that doesn't really look like it has persistent value. Like, I had a bunch of friends of mine come to me when the ICO started and say, oh my gosh, we know how to make a whole bunch of money, you should come do this. And I kind of went, participating in a system where the last fool is the person who's fleeced in this is uninteresting, either ethically, right, or just spiritually in terms of how this is. So I'm not, like, I haven't participated in an ICO yet because I haven't seen an ICO that really seems like it's trying to define a future good human interaction. I'm not saying there isn't one. Like, someone could come up to me and say, what about this one? I'm like, oh, didn't see that one. So I'm not saying it's impossible and not there. But the whole question would be is, why would the growing participation of people, as opposed to the like asset speculation as the last fool, but why would rationally people next year and the year after ascribe the kind of right kind of system of value to this? And a lot of these ICOs don't have good answers to that question, even though they're like, well, people will buy them. And people buying, this is a little bit like the classic technology leaders being philosophically unsophisticated. It's like, well, just because people buy them doesn't mean they're good. Right, so.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all that we have time for. Thank you so much for your thoughts, and thank you all for your great questions.
Thank you so much, Reid and Jennifer, for this intriguing conversation on values as they relate to technology and its societal impact. We have a lot to think about, thanks to you tonight. We invite all of you to attend the May 3rd Morris Lecture featuring Sylvia Earle on innovation in ocean conservation. I'd also like to announce that the Society Fellows in the Bay Area is continuing to grow. And for those of you who are members, you can look forward to an intimate discussion reception on networks and power with Neil Ferguson on February 15th. For those of you who are not yet a member and have interest in joining, just let me know or another member of our Aspen Institute staff, and we'd be happy to have you join our family. Thank you all for being an important part of the conversation tonight with the Aspen Institute, and thanks again to Diane Morris for underwriting the Morris Lecture Series. And with that, I bid you adieu, and for those of you celebrating, Happy Hanukkah.